Welcome to Belonging Reimagined. I'm your host, Dr. Mona. As a mental health therapist, professor, and researcher, I guide folks in owning their belonging journey and exploring barriers to belonging. In this podcast, I explore real stories with phenomenal guests about how to experience both interconnection and interdependence. And my hope for you is that you learn ways to experience more connection in the world around you and the world within yourself. We don't have to do this life thing alone. You're right where you belong. Today, folks, we have Chavi Koneru with us, and we're really thrilled to have this conversation with you about an experience that both of us actually share, different experiences, but some similar identities, and that is being bicultural. And for the sake of today's podcast, and what we see a lot in academia and the term that we're hearing more often, bicultural means coming from a recent immigrant background, not to be confused with being biracial or multiracial, meaning having multiple different racial backgrounds. So having said that, for us, we both come from recent immigrant backgrounds. My parents immigrated from Egypt, and we'll hear a lot more about you, Chavi. And I'm excited to talk about this story about immigration, what that looks like for kids who are raised here after their parents have immigrated here, and how our experiences are unique in terms of just our psychosocial development, making friends, trying to figure out where we belong in the world. And it has really been the impetus to the research that I've done. And, when I heard about you and learned about you from a mutual friend, I was really thrilled to meet you. And right away when we met, we just kind of started chatting and very quickly led to realizing that we have these very similar experiences, and we kind of chuckled a lot, and I felt very seen, and I felt a sense of belonging, honestly, right away. So I thank you for that, by the way, and obviously for being here today. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start out with talking about something that I think every bicultural kid has like a story behind, and that is like their parents' immigration story, right? And their family's immigration story, and oftentimes starts back in their parents' native land, and why they ended up moving here and what that looked like for them. What is your family's immigration story?
My family is Punjabi and originally from an area, a part of India that was impacted by the partition of India and Pakistan, or the creation of these two places. So my mom's family was displaced during the partition. My grandparents lost a lot of their belongings. And I think that sort of refugee trauma has sort of continued through generations. I think it's a really key part of my mom's side of the family story. So they began living in Delhi, close to Delhi, in a bunch of nearer towns. And that's like the north of India. And they were, I think they had all experienced a time in their life where they had a lot of privilege, and then experienced a time post-displacement where they were lower middle class. And that was my experience of visiting them in India. It was very much their reality now. My dad's side of the family, slightly different, also Punjabi, but because my grandfather was part of the Indian government, was sort of traveling. My dad had a very different experience. He grew up in villages where he felt a deep sense of belonging, even though he was like the equivalent of like an army kid today. But he was like very comfortable with the local villagers. And so, my parents grew up coming from the same ethnic background, but with very, very different experiences, which they then brought with them to the US. My dad, this is kind of a fun story. He went with his friend to Delhi. His friend was like, I'm going to take this exam and I want someone to come with me. So my dad went, he took a test for fun. He's kind of a nerd. And at the end of the test, it said, put down the name of 2 American colleges. And so he put down the name of the only 2 schools he'd ever heard of, Harvard and Yale. And it turned out it was a college entrance exam. Yale rejected him because they thought he was a woman and said, we don't accept women. This is, a long time ago.
Wow.
And Harvard accepted him. And so he took a boat by himself, left his entire family, and just showed up at Harvard and worked his way through college there. He had a full scholarship, but he had to work as janitor, a cook, all sorts of different things in order to have enough money to pay for everything besides what the school was paying for through his scholarship. And then my dad got married here in the U.S. To a white person who was fully American. And I had an older sister who had very different experiences than me. They ended up getting divorced. My dad moved back to India, met my mom through a typical sort of arranged marriage experience. So my mom left her entire family to come here. And here, meaning California, is where I grew up initially. And so we spent a lot of time in India because my mom's entire family was there. And so that bicultural experience was particularly vivid for me because I would spend about 6 months in India, 6 months in the US until about the time I went to high school.
Oh, wow. How did that work with school?
Well, you can do a lot of projects in India, so I'd always do something like that. I did a lot of work on my own, and my parents were really supportive about talking to my teachers about it, so I never fell behind, but it certainly impacted my ability to make friends because I would spend the half the year in a different country with cousins and relatives who, at that time, pre-internet, treated me like royalty because I was from America, whereas all I wanted was to fit in. I wanted to be just like them. I'm fluent in Hindi, which is the language most of them spoke. And I thought, I'm no different from you. They saw me as like someone who was coming from this really exciting country and was bringing these exciting experiences. And then I'd come back here and I had no idea what people were doing over the summer. I had no idea what music people were listening to. I can tell you every single thing about 90s Bollywood that you'd want to know. Can't tell you very much at all about what was happening in like pop culture in America in the 90s, late 80s and early 90s.
I got goosebumps when you were talking about your dad literally getting on a boat by himself, going to Harvard. I mean, the kind of goosebumps that hurt, it's like, whoa, that's intense. And with everything that you just shared, the thing that resonates so deeply with me is the pop culture part. Mm-hmm. I can recall not wanting to go to Egypt to visit my cousins and to visit my family and grandparents and aunts and uncles there, because anytime I would go, even if I went for 3 or 4 weeks at a time only, when I would come back, I didn't know all the popular movies. Yep. I didn't know all the popular music, especially, that was going on. And if I would meet up with friends, they could sing all the words and I didn't know it. We didn't have, Spotify and Apple Music and like streaming services back then. And as silly as that might sound, we really do bond over pop culture. I mean, we see people all the time doing that with like social media, And if they take social media breaks, I've had students who, when I taught the substance use and addictions class in the past, where they'd have to pick some kind of, they would call it a vice for 6 weeks that they would give up. And so a lot of them would give up social media. And they would talk about how they would be around their friends and feel like they didn't connect or belong because they wouldn't be able to see what their friends were doing, or they wouldn't keep up with like TikTok trends or whatever was going on. And it's interesting because pop culture is one of those things that really does connect us in so many ways. It's this shared experience that we're having and looking at different perspectives that people are having on, this music or that music, and especially hip hop in the 90s was a big thing. So yeah, I mean, that actually really deeply resonates because it is especially when we're younger, something that we spend a lot of time talking about with our peers.
Yes. and there was no internet to go look it up and try to catch up. It was like,
Yeah.
you really missed it. You know,
Yeah.
what the movie that was in the movie theater over the summer that you didn't get to watch with your friends, you don't get to watch for quite a while now. And so you don't know the sort of, jokes they're making about it or any other references to it. So yeah,
Yeah.
it felt like a really big piece of belonging.
Particularly when we are really exploring our social place in the world and our identities in that time of our lives as teenagers, and your tone of voice might be changing over time, your voice is changing, and that there's so much, your body's changing, and so trying to
Mm-hmm.
figure out how you even physically fit in your own body, it kind of goes along with some of the social aspects too, but it's very, very challenging. But it sounds like the positive thing that you had going on was being able to speak Hindi fluently, and so being there, you're able to have that connection with your cousins, at least in that way, it sounded like.
Yes, I definitely had that, but I remember them giving me such a hard time about my American accent when I spoke Hindi, to the point where I would record myself, on our old school like little tape cassette recorder
Yeah.
and listen to it and say, what is it that they're hearing? And I couldn't hear it because I thought I sounded exactly like them, but it was something that really bothered me because why do they see me as different? Why do they think I have an accent? I truthfully don't think it existed. I think it was just like this perception from their end of like, you're still not quite one of us. And I don't think they meant it to be, they didn't mean to exclude me with that way, but more to kind of put me up on a pedestal of like, look, you're this American who speaks Hindi fluently. And it might have made them also feel better about the differences between my life and theirs, which were quite stark at that time.
In which ways?
Oh, like very basic things. I mean, this was, in the early 90s, like they didn't have toilets the way that we have them now. There was not running water. The electricity was shut off half the day. And this was when I was there, I experienced this with them. And to me, this was part of my experience as much as theirs, but this was their everyday life. I, 3, 4, 6 months later, got to come back to the luxury and comfort of my American home with running water in the shower anytime I turned it down and toilets that flushed and central air conditioning. And so there were those differences where for me, it was a moment in time, basically, that I was sort of putting up with these hardships, whereas this was their everyday life.
Yeah. And I'm wondering how you felt about those differences yourself. I mean, because I've heard so many people feel like, oh, I learned gratitude from it. And other people felt a lot of guilt from it. It's very different for many folks. I'm curious about yours.
Well, I think there are times that I felt gratitude, but it was more when I would see sort of beggars in the street and that it wasn't the same experience in the US. Like that sort of poverty wasn't as much in my face in the US. But in terms of those day-to-day things, I was like, that's what I do when I'm here. The things that I missed was like pizza. Like I just wanted some real pizza and
Yeah.
that does not exist in India.
Right.
So
Right.
those were the things. And I remember, I'd kind of get to a point where I'd be like itching to get home. So I knew that I certainly knew that there were privileges at home that I wasn't getting here, but I also really enjoyed going. And I enjoyed that
Yeah.
connection that I had with my cousins that in some ways wasn't replicated in the US. Like my entire childhood felt like code switching all the
Mm.
time. And I think I treasured just those brief moments of belonging while I was there and wasn't as aware of sort of the external things.
Good for you for sticking to speaking Hindi. I know for so many people with whom I've met who are bicultural, including myself, that relationship with cousins can really make or break whether or not we decide to continue learning the language and using it. And so for you to feel kind of made fun of a little bit, or at least those things pointed out, and to still stick with it is like kudos on you. Like, that's amazing. I can tell
Thank
you
you.
that for me, it was because of my cousins making fun of me. Like, love them to pieces. I really, really do. And just like you said, they didn't realize the harm. They didn't know how it was impacting me. I just stopped speaking it altogether, and started teaching them English to some degree. And we would just kind of piece things together. And it got to where I could really understand probably about 80 to 85% of what was being said, unless they were making like certain jokes or something like that I didn't get. But I could understand the vast majority of what I was hearing. But when I would respond, my grammar was all off. I mean, it's a challenging language, very much like Hindi and Greek. They're all very Chinese. They're very difficult languages to learn. And so I would just respond back in English, or I would just say it to my mom or dad and have them kind of say it to them in Arabic. But yeah, it's tough. And so now at 50 years old, I really regret it, because I still, unless I've been there for a few weeks, I still talk like a 3-year-old, because that's when I started that code switching that you're talking about back to English. So, and the research that I've done, and I've mentioned this before too, there are two main predictors that I found in terms of people having more hyphenated bicultural identities. So I'll use myself as an example. The more I am able to speak, the more proficient I am, rather, in Arabic, then the more likely I have more hyphenated identities and less code switching. And pairing that with belonging, where the more I feel a sense of belonging within my family, within my friends, and different communities within myself, then the more likely I'm going to have a more hyphenated sense of self. So less code switching, less feeling like I have to only be Egyptian in this space and only be American in this space, which is impossible, by the way. We can't really
Yes.
leave those identities behind. One of the things I ask folks a lot about whenever I am working with clients, but also just in interacting with people who are bicultural, are what were your experiences in the cafeteria, and
Mm.
what were your experiences with sleepovers? And so I'm curious to hear that from
Oh.
you. Yeah, because I think it tells a lot about belonging.
I found as an adult, and since I've been sort of working in this environment, that I have connected with a lot of people from other cultures who had the same sleepover experiences, where bottom line, our parents didn't let us go to sleepovers. It was like a very odd thing. And the only time we were permitted sleepovers was like if it was a good family friend, and like,
Mhm.
our parents knew them really well. Definitely didn't happen till I was older. Um, and I've noticed, I have a good friend who's Colombian. And I remember that was one of the first things we bonded over was there's some sort of icebreaker question about what was the one piece of advice that your mom kept hammering into you. And it was like, you don't do sleepovers. And as an adult who now has children, I kind of understand the concern. It was a very odd thing for our culture. Going back to the food, though, that actually has been a traumatic thing for me, because my mom would pack my lunches and she would pack Indian food. That's all we ate. And it would have certain smells. It would have, people would have certain reactions to it. And it led me to just become uncomfortable with food in general, because my parents weren't going to pay for me to get school lunches, maybe once in a while, but they were like, hey, it's cheaper for us to make lunch with the food that we already have. And like many immigrant families, like money was definitely something that they were thoughtful about. And
Mhm.
so, it wasn't like, hey, if you don't like this lunch, I'll give you a Lunchable instead. And so it was either eat that lunch or don't eat lunch. And sometimes I would choose to not eat lunch because I was so uncomfortable with other people's reactions to the food. And it actually has taken me until now, when I have children, to realize I'm really uncomfortable in the kitchen because of these deep seated fears and concerns about food. I just completely push it away. Like, I don't want to learn how to cook. I don't want to be in this environment, because that was, I think, a place where I didn't know how to code switch. I've been vegetarian my entire life. And growing up in the South, it was very, very difficult to be vegetarian. And I didn't have a desire to stop being vegetarian. So instead, I would get handed a bun or a roll or honestly half a head of lettuce sometimes. And I didn't like the attention around it. So it just made me uncomfortable with food in general.
My entire fourth grade, the snack that I would take to school was half a head of lettuce, by the way. It's exactly what I
So
would
you
take.
can relate.
It's literally what I would take to school. And I remember having pita bread, and they didn't know what that was. It was like this whole new thing. This is back in the 70s and 80s because I'm 50 years old. And they did not know what this bread was. And if you imagine, like, if all you'd ever seen was Wonder Bread, right? Which was essentially all they had seen at that time, which sliced bread really was still kind of a newer thing. At that time, it was still considered amazing, right? And if that's all you've ever seen, they were just like, what is that? That's wild. There's a certain kind of attention that is positive attention, that's nice to have. And then there's certain attention that doesn't feel so positive. And there was sometimes some ambiguity around food with me. I didn't know if they were saying it was, gross, or if they were saying that it was, fascinating. Either way, it felt kind of exoticized and also sort of villainized and very certainly othered. And interestingly, as I talk about this now with you, that's actually how I felt too.
Mm-hmm.
And that connection that we have, again, with, earlier we were talking about pop culture, but food is also such a big part of culture. You're talking about like pizza back in the US. I mean, food is such a part of culture.
True.
And yeah. And so when we're attached to that culture in some way, then it feels like they're talking about us. So if they're talking about your food, then what are they saying about you? Or how are they attaching those adjectives or perspectives to you as well? That was always really, really, really tough. And that's why I ask about the cafeteria, because a lot of times it's the food, but also it can be like, who were you sitting with in the cafeteria? Was there a negotiation around that for you?
I almost feel like I've blocked out a lot of cafeteria memories because it was painful for me. And I really resonate with what you're saying about like the feeling of, am I being liked because I'm seen as exotic, or am I being liked right now because of me? And I remember having conversations with my mom about my lunch and just being like really upset and saying, I just want to be normal. I just want my lunch to look normal. And at the time, normal was, what are most of the people around you doing? My school was pretty white. So it's like, what are the white people doing? That's what I want to do, because I just want to fit in. I just want to belong. And I think as a kid, you don't understand all these nuances. So all you know is, I'm being othered, right? And that doesn't feel good to anybody. I want to be part of them, whatever it takes.
Were they allowed to come spend the night at your home?
I had one friend in second grade. I remember that she started being allowed to spend the night. My parents had gotten to know her parents very well, and they weren't, I would say, comfortable with it, but they felt like, all right, these seem like responsible people. Maybe her dad was a police officer. I can't remember, but there was something about it that made them feel like, okay, this is a safe household for you to be in. And then they started letting me eventually spend the night at her place. And it was, life changing, but they had to really get to know someone before they were comfortable with that, all the way until high school.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's really, really typical. We have a friend, who came over to visit with one of our kids the other day, actually a group of friends. And, my kid's almost an adult now, 17. And so one of the kids was 19, and they were all like 17, 18, 19. So one of them's 19 and is a Latino kid. And he said He had never spent the night at anyone's home ever before in his
Mm-hmm.
life. And that this was the very, very first time that he was doing that. And he was so wowed by the whole experience. He was like, wow, this is amazing. Like, this is
Yeah.
how people do things in these different homes, and he felt very comfortable right away. I was just a great, great kid. But it was really interesting. I was like, wow, I'm really honored that you would feel comfortable to come and spend an evening here, especially since, my kid is a newer friend for this person. And so
Yeah.
he's like, no, your kid's such a
That's great.
respectable person. He's so respectable and so kind. And we got to do this
Yeah.
more, the whole group. So they wanted to come over more often. And so it was great. But yeah, they're essentially adults now and had never had
Yeah.
that experience before, but kind of had the wide-eyed experience of like being a child, it was really, really
Yeah.
sweet. So
And
yeah.
I wonder also that the friend that I had was Black. And I mentioned this because I do think that there's some cultural similarities there where they felt like, okay, these parents also have this like strong cultural belief in safety. And, they're sort of sleepovers for Black families and Latino families and Asian families weren't the same as they were for white families. And so
Yeah.
I think there was like a deeper level of comfort there. The other thing I was going to say is that I also feel like I've been parented biculturally because, as I mentioned, my dad came here when he was 17, went to college here. He was here for a lot longer than most Indian immigrants of his generation, whereas my mom came here after she got married. And so she had a lot more traditional perspectives, whereas my dad grew up here and he had a child that was half white and he felt like, why can't the same rules apply? So I remember my parents having a lot of tension with my dad being okay with sleepovers as early as first grade and my mom being like, wait, I don't know how I feel about this. I really need to suss out this family first.
Yeah.
So that was sort of a interesting like layer of bicultural experience.
And that's one of the things I think we have to keep in mind too, is that not everyone has the same story. They come at different ages into the country. They're coming at different psychosocial developmental stages in their lives as well. And also for different reasons. We have people who are coming here as refugees, very different mindset and motivations to kind of assimilate, right? In many ways, it could be harder sometimes to hold on to cultural values, depending on the different circumstances of someone's life. So context is important. Context is really important. So now how do you see a difference in your children's experiences? You have 4-year-old, 7-year-old kids. Those are fun ages, by the way. Wait till middle school. Sorry to scare you.
I am enjoying these ages better than the toddler ages, I'd say.
Yeah.
So my partner is also Indian, but from a completely different region of India, different immigrant experience. I always mention that because just people think just because you're from the same, ethnic background or racial background, you're the same. And we are very, very different. But I think the reason that we ended up finding each other is because of some core beliefs. And I think our values are really centered around all the good things we've taken out of these two cultures. Like we've both had these bicultural upbringings and sort of been able to pick and choose, which I think is the privilege of having these two cultural experiences. And so, there's all these things that we're trying to teach our kids, but that the really key difference is also the environment that our kids are growing up in, right? Post-internet, people just know more about each other. They are more receptive to each other in certain ways. I was very intentional about making sure that my kids went to a school where there was at least 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or more people that looked just like them, so that they never had that feeling of, I'm the only one that looks this way. And then you can build the base of like explaining the differences, the similarities. I think the environment today is just so much more accepting of diversity. You mentioned the pita bread, right? And to me, that's like the perfect example of everyone eats pita bread now. Like everyone, it's Indian food. It's, and I remember having to explain simple things like bindis, like, oh, why do women wear bindis? There's a cultural reason, there's a significance. And then Gwen Stefani started wearing bindis. And I remember feeling so irritated by that. Like, how come she gets to wear this and everyone suddenly thinks it's cool? And that was still the 90s. And we've come such a long way with our understandings. I think there's still a portion of people that treat us as exotic. And I make every effort as a parent to shield my children from those type of people because I want them to feel like they belong in this state, in this country, in their Indianness, in their Americanness. And I don't want anyone to treat them as exotic, whether that's good or bad.
Yeah, yeah. And so for our listeners, exotic is not a compliment. I don't know really anyone. Maybe I'm sure there are people out there, but most of us who are Black and brown, BIPOC, do not experience that word as a compliment. It feels very othering. It does not feel like you see us. It seems like you see just our physical features and that you're connected to something with our cultural background that you don't understand, that seems mysterious in some way, and that does not feel good. And particularly being Egyptian, and so many people are obsessed with the pyramids and the Sphinx and ancient Egyptian, hieroglyphics and all this, they just immediately see me as exotic and start asking me a lot of like history, Egyptian history.
Yeah,
I'm like,
right.
I don't know anything about anything. Okay. I mean, I'm doing the best I can, y'all.
Which has nothing to do with your day-to-day culture. Like if they really wanted to get to know Egyptian culture, there's a whole different set of questions they could be asking.
And I'm going to come asking you about it, right? Because I don't know that stuff. I mean, first of all, I'm not as interested in certain histories as it might seem. Like there's this assumption that like I'm going to know all this. There's also people that say, well, you should know. I'm like, you don't even know your own ethnic background. Don't tell me what I should know. We all have certain interests in the same way that like being American doesn't mean that you know every single battle that was fought and won and don't even know the order of the dang presidents, y'all. I mean, it's the same way. Like there's a much longer Egyptian history. I don't know all that stuff. So, those kinds of things now make me chuckle a little bit, but, sometimes I have to educate folks a little bit. Say, I don't know, I'm not good with trivia, first of all, but yeah, some of these assumptions, in other words, but yeah, the exotic word is really leave that more for animals. Yeah, we'll leave it at that. Yeah, not anything else.
I like that.
Yeah. So you moved then from California to North Carolina in 1989. Yes?
Yeah. Yep. When I was 7.
You ended up like going through school here, finishing school here. Then you went to UNC, Chapel Hill, undergrad and law school.
Mm-hmm.
And then started, do I have the order right? And then started North Carolina Asian Americans Together.
I actually moved to DC after that. I spent most of my childhood trying to get the heck out of North Carolina. I really didn't feel that sense of belonging here. And that really is the best word to describe it because I just never felt like I could claim the state. Mm-hmm. And then I moved to DC thinking, I'm going to work on civil rights law here. And people would ask where I was from. And it was the first time in my life that I didn't say California. And the longer I was in DC, the more I started to realize that there was parts of being North Carolinian that were a part of me, the way that I saw being North Carolinian. And it gave me the opportunity to feel like I could come home or that I could even call this home. So I moved back to North Carolina in 2014 and then started working on this project that then turned into an organization in 2016. And the core of starting this organization really was creating a space for people like me who, could feel the sense of belonging, who deserve to be here, deserve to feel like North Carolinians. And there's an element of there's finally enough of us that we can have a loud voice. We can demand a seat at the table. We can demand to be heard and seen as people, as individuals, not as exotic, right? Not as these
Right.
few people from these different ethnic groups that are starting a store or get featured in the newspaper sometimes for the Diwali celebration. We get to be whole people that are Asian American, Indian American, whatever it is, and we get to have our own opinions and political views and issues that we care about. We're not just immigrants who just care about immigration. It was our chance to actually be like, this is who we are.
That's phenomenal. And the organization has really grown. Can you tell us a little bit about the mission?
Yeah. So the idea behind it, and this comes from me having focused on voting rights law while I was in law school, was that voting, civic engagement, democratic participation was one path and an important part of building power and creating change in the state. So those are the things that we focused on. We also do a lot of youth leadership institutes, youth leadership opportunities. Now we've started an adult leadership summit. Because the idea is for people to sort of come into their own. Like, we don't want to lead people. We want them to lead themselves. We want them to learn how to use the tools that are available to them. We're happy to offer them these trainings, and then to know how to build power in their own communities, to be representatives themselves, to really make the changes in the state that they believe need to happen.
You're really making a difference. And so,
Thank you.
Call to action there is get out and vote, folks. This is a really tough election year for so many folks. It's not just bringing up, people say it's like a heated election year. It's beyond that. It's activating old traumas in folks. And so, again, the call to action and what your organization is doing is really come together and vote. That is where we have a voice. Even if it doesn't feel like it in your particular area, go do it anyway. It is a celebration of self, and it's a celebration of your communities in so many ways. So, Chavi, last question. What does belonging mean to you?
It means bringing my whole self to spaces. We talked about code switching earlier, and I am so grateful that I'm at a point in my life where I no longer have to do that. It's so core. It's become such a core part of my identity, and I notice that I begin to feel anxious when I can't bring my whole self to a space. And that's when I feel like I don't belong. And, with starting North Carolina Asian Americans Together, one of the really amazing things, we're now a staff of 23, is I get to come into work with a bunch of people who, like you and me, have grown up with bicultural upbringings or who have been othered. And we all get to come into this space with exactly who we are, with all our various identities, not being put in a box. And we get to just be. And that's what belonging is to me.
Belonging is the experience of being whole.
Mm-hmm.
None of that fragmentation, because that's really what code switching is, where I have to leave this part of me behind and I have to bring this part forward, and all that internal navigation and that external navigation. It is anxiety inducing. And when we do that, not only do we feel like we're not belonging in the space that we're in, but not belonging within ourselves, that we're abandoning certain parts of ourselves. And so really inviting your whole self forward is such a gift. And I think it's testament to where belonging can really start from within. So thank you for sharing that. And thank you for being with us today. It was a great conversation. Hope you come back to join us. So much wisdom that you can share with us, so much knowledge, and we appreciate you. Thank you so much, Chavi.
Thank you so much for having this conversation with me.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode. All of the show notes and links can be found on my website at drmonanour.com. That's drmonanour.com. Throughout most episodes, you'll hear me referring to the belonging model that I developed, which is represented by a belonging life map that helps you explore areas in your life where you feel more connection and areas where you might feel more isolation. And you can get a free copy of your own belonging life map on my website. Again, that's drmonanour.com. If you like the Belonging Reimagined podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a review. That can help more folks find us and keep more episodes coming. Until next time, I'm Dr. Mona. You're right where you belong.